Welcome, everyone, to Trail Talks, the International Trail Running Association's podcast series. I'm your host, Stephanie Case, speaking to you from Chamonix, France. When we polled the trail running community, when we asked you, the listeners, what you wanted to hear about on Trail Talks, the most popular answer we received was about training advice for quote unquote the normal athlete or the average runner. We heard you. And we immediately thought of Megan and David, not only for their impressive credentials, which I will go through in a moment, but also because we thought it was important to have both male and female voices in this discussion. So who are Megan and David? Start with Megan. I should say Dr. Megan. She is the 2016 USA Track and Field Trail Runner of the Year at the ultra and sub-ultra distances, a 5-time national champion, a North American mountain running champion, and a 6-time member of Team USA. She has a degree in neuroscience, received her MD from Stanford Medical School. And at Stanford, she also earned a PhD in epidemiology, focused on female athlete health and performance research. David is the 2014 USA Track and Field Trail Runner of the Year at the sub-ultra distance. He's a 2-time national champion and a 3-time member of Team USA. He has a degree in environmental science and received a master's degree and a law degree with honors from Duke University. They're also parents and run their own podcast and coaching business called Some Work, All Play, which I love, Swap. And you guys want to start your podcast with a little woohoo. So I feel like I should say, woohoo, welcome to the podcast.
We should do it together. Ready? Can we count to 3? 1, 2, 3. Woohoo! Yeah, that's how. Sometimes actually we miss the timing. We do like a false start at the start of a race, and we like do an early woohoo, and it's a good vibe.
Usually we can just kind of overlap now.
Yeah,
we
harmonize.
Feel the vibes.
David, you are coming to this podcast literally with a concussion. Last week, you got into a pretty serious bike accident where a car actually struck you, launched you 100 feet through the air, resulting in a concussion, broken wrist, lacerations. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling like lucky and full of gratitude. I mean, it's one of those situations where, we all have our worst case scenarios, and on the bike, that's like the worst case scenario, but it didn't lead to the worst case outcome. And that offset is actually kind of a great place to be, because you can enjoy like the fact that 1, you're alive, but 2, you are made to reckon with the impermanence of life in such a visceral way. And so I'm reckoning with that impermanence a little bit sore right now, but coming around and just thankful for everybody out there who reached out and just feeling so much love in this last week. So, I would, if I could turn back time, I would make it not happen. But now that it did, just full of love and gratitude.
Well, I was really impressed because we went back to the accident site a couple days ago, and you were so curious about it. You because you couldn't remember what happened there. I was out for 30 minutes. Wanted to know all the details, and it was almost this investigative report. And I just thought it was really interesting to see your brain putting those pieces together, and almost I feel like it was almost like recovery in a sense of putting it together and almost having the final say, or reclaiming even the spot that it happened. And I actually just got in from a ride 25 minutes ago, and it was a little jarring for me to be on the bike. Every time a car came by me for the first 10 minutes, I was flinching. And then it's wild. I think the cool thing about sports is the power of endorphins, because I was out there and I was just bopping away on gravel and really having a great time. And I have a feeling that when you get out for your first ride, it'll be similar, where the first 15 or 20 minutes are jarring, and then you'll be this is fun.
Okay. Well, going on to, I want to talk about your background coaching and how you guys actually came together, because I think you've been together for 14 years now. Is that right?
Nailed it. Look at that. I was doing the math in my head, and I'm we should probably trust your math more than our math. Yeah.
I want to know, how did you guys meet? And when you did you think, wow, I'm looking in a mirror, because your bios are eerily similar, or did you kind of grow more similar together?
We met through a mutual friend. So I knew her in high school, and David knew her in college. And her name's Hannah, and she's an endurance athlete herself. And I would say she's wildly eccentric in the best of ways. She's one of the few female smoke jumpers out there. She does really cool pottery. And so when she told me I had to meet this person, David, I was both I really need to meet this person, and also simultaneously kind of scared at the same time. And so we canceled on each other a bunch of times. I was in college, and David was a law student at the time, and we finally met up for ice cream. And it was just one of those moments where we just talked to each other for a really long time. Yeah. And we did at the time. I feel the beauty of being in a relationship is I feel you often grow together. And I feel we've grown together in similar parallel ways, but we did have a lot of eerily similar things at the start that I think we both noticed even within the first 20 minutes of talking to each other.
Yeah. So we had very different upbringings, but I think similar value structures within those upbringings.
That's a great way to describe it.
To the point that, it's like all relationships. You have to have overlap in the places that matter with like how you view the world, not necessarily what you do. And it just so happened that what we ended up doing ended up like exactly converging.
David took me on my first like trail run, and it was 6 miles, and I bonked probably within like 4 of those because I was just like such a strength and power based athlete. But it was like the thrill of running behind you was like immediately exhilarating, and I was like, sign me up for more. This is great.
But on the first hill, she did drop me.
So poor pacing.
Yeah, but as a field hockey player, even then, it's like, oh, that's what talent looks like right there.
I want to talk about your philosophy around running happy a little bit later, but going into your training methodology, it's based a lot around science and research, which makes complete sense given your backgrounds. How much are you looking at the latest research that's out there and using it to tweak your advice to your clients?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I feel like we're looking at the research a lot, primarily because we have a podcast and it's cool research and it's like fun to summarize, make jokes about, and to like partially inform our training theory. But I think it's interesting. Like, I feel like we have this hybrid approach where there's the science, but then there's like so much anecdotal evidence that we've gathered over the years from our athletes. And I hope that as coaches, like one of our biggest assets is that we're very open-minded. And so we're constantly like iterating and trying to learn and incorporating new research. But at the same time too, I think you can almost be too open-minded. And so like, I feel like we've had this approach of like staying grounded in some of our core tenets of like building running economy and speed and, prioritizing like, high carbohydrate fueling and really helping athletes being like the healthiest versions of themselves. And then like iterating on like the small details. And I think it's been really helpful to be grounded in that, like the true basis, and then have like science inform some of that like surrounding principles.
Yeah. And I think one of the big problems is sometimes people view exercise physiology as medicine, and it absolutely is not in any way. Like in medical fields, you have clinical trials. It's very rigorous. It's very detailed like that. In running, almost always the scientific studies follow the field-based practices and then might give you a rationale for them, but rarely do they drive the field-based practices. And you can think of it in a simple numbers-based approach in that, let's say on the track and in the road marathons and things like that, we've had millions of data points, at least hundreds of thousands of data points, pushing the pure limits of human performance. Within that like massive morass of data, you'll have certain things rise to the top. And over time, people will all iterate off that over the course of decades. And, now we're going on 75 years of advanced training theory. So where training theory comes, it has this massive N value in the millions of people. And then you have a study that has like, even the great ones, 50 of an N value in a time horizon of 6 weeks rather than 10 years.
And they're all men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we love the research, but usually what is most fascinating to us in the research is one, when it validates something that the training theory has started to coalesce around. We've seen that a lot with Norwegian training principles, let's say, like how the double threshold workouts have now been supported in the research, even though they had no basis in it before. Or something that totally contradicts conventional wisdom, where that might not say that the conventional wisdom is wrong, but it probably points out some mechanism that people aren't thinking about nearly enough. And so we try to view it all really open-mindedly, but also trying to think about, okay, is this telling us a different story than the conclusion says in the abstract? Because often that's the case, I think, with exercise physiology.
It's so interesting because you mentioned marathons. I think in road races, there's a lot more data points we have
Definitely,
for that. But when it comes to ultra running and trail running, I just feel like it's great every time we get a new study, but there's so few, and we'll get into this, Megan, especially on women. There's so few studies out there that we actually don't really know in science, maybe a lot of what is happening and what's going on. And so having coaches, having experts that can see it firsthand from their clients and kind of iterate to see what works and what doesn't. Would you say it's almost more intuitive? It's kind of a mix of intuition and science?
Yeah, and I think it's a mix of like, here's the anecdotes of what we've seen of like pro athletes, but also like other, like, sometimes pro athletes are these like genetic outliers, and it's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be deriving theory from genetic outliers. And so I think a combination of like, for us, synthesizing all the data points that we've seen like throughout our historical time of coaching, and then trying to learn from other coaching greats too. Like there's so many amazing coaches right now, like Mike Smith in the US, like tons of like coaches that are utilizing different training theories. And like he coaches more track and road athletes, but it's like some of those principles also probably apply to ultra runners too. And I think for us, like being as open-minded as possible and talking to as many people simple as possible and like trying to synthesize that.
Yeah. And I think one place that we've hopefully pushed things a little bit within the trail world is this isn't remaking the wheel. The training theory and physiology is training theory and physiology. Speed is speed. And I think sometimes, because in ultras in particular, there are so many variables that it's very hard to find the driver of causation. Mm-hmm. It's really easy to grasp onto things that are not actually driving the causation as the driver, or to say this person's approach is the optimal one just because, one, they're a genetic freak, two, the competition is less strenuous in terms of the depth of it. And three, there's 8 million variables. And so the athletes that might be the most equipped for the best day don't have the best day a lot in this sport. And so in that framework, just trying to be like, all right, just intuitively, what is the variables what are the variables that matter? Like, and how can we then, extrapolate that out to these really long ultras? And that's why, one of my favorite studies was done at UTMB, and they just did all of these fitness measurements on these athletes. And the only thing that ended up correlating with eventual place or performance at UTMB was an athlete's velocity at VO2 max. So in other words, essentially their 5K pace. And it's not that simple. Like, that's another study subject to those types of disclaimers. But the point just being, even at UTMB, speed matters. And that's a small little conclusion on that gets layered into hundreds of others. And
I think we can extend that out to multi-day efforts too, because I feel like as the distance goes on, the research gets like less and less rigorous and less robust, because it's like simply it's just hard to study over these longer duration of events. Like, I was just at the Lululemon Further event, which was a 6-day ultra marathon for 10 women, and they were collecting so many different variables. And I'm so excited to see the research that comes out of it, because I feel like, yes, we have some studies done on UTMB, but it's like to do studies on like 6-day sorts of events, it's like the research just really starts to break down. And so I'm excited to see like more and more like multi-day research coming out. And my hypothesis is that we're going to find similar things to what we found with UTMB. It's just that the variables of like nutrition and sleep and like strategy of the race itself also become really relevant. But I really do think it still gets back to like running economy and speed development.
Definitely.
I thought the Lululemon event was really interesting because it was generating new research, new data, hopefully. But what I also found was interesting was that some people found that it should have even gone farther. Sarah Lavender Smith in the US, she had written about the event and how it actually missed out on the menopausal, postmenopausal age group, which is another whole category of women runners that we don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to or have enough research on. So it just seems like there's a lot of work to do in that area, but I'm going to get to that later. What I want to dive into is talking about training for the average athlete. Now, you guys state outright that every athlete is elite, so maybe my question is quite flawed from the outset. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think actually what we mean by that is that I think there's a training theory that's relevant. And I think we don't know who the Courtney Dauwalters and the Jim Walmsleys are going to be until we treat athletes like Courtney Dauwalter and Jim Walmsley. And I think like through our coaching, we have uncovered athletes that might not think that they have quote unquote like the talent to be an elite athlete, but we see something in them early on and give them the training like they're an elite athlete, and eventually they get there. And so I think like I just think there's a notion of that, like, we have training philosophy and training theory. And I think, yes, we tweak it for athletes at different levels, but I think the core tenets are very similar. And it's been helpful, I think, for us to think about that. And I think it's helped us develop athletes in the long term, and then also like help athletes believe in themselves too, because I don't think like you can fully reach your true potential unless you're like investing in yourself like an elite athlete too.
Yeah. And it all gets back to what we mean by the word talent. And, elite will come into that later, in the sense that there are probably a million different variables, if we can measure someone's physiology and psychology on such a granular level, that are relevant here. And yes, if the variable that you are world class at is VO2 max, you might find that exploring your elite athlete potential is much easier, and it comes a little bit more simply to you than some other people. But I guarantee that every single person listening to this is one of the world's best at one of those variables of the millions that there are to measure, that some of which we can measure, some of which we can't.
And some of which are combinations of themselves. Yeah,
exactly. And so the only way to explore how that potential can unfold is to think of yourself and to approach it all like you are the elite athlete you are, because in some ways you absolutely are. And the way that will manifest in your journey might not be the first time you run like one of those high VO2 max monsters. It might take 47 years, and you might not fully see it till you're 68, and you're all of a sudden the best 68-year-old out there. But it's there. And so one of the coolest things we've seen in coaching is if you give someone that love and ability to believe in themselves within that framework, usually they'll be able to accomplish things that they never dreamed possible. And even if that doesn't end up on the top of a podium or even top of an age group, it's still a valid pursuit. And so we want everyone to train like an elite athlete, because on some level, I promise you are.
It's really interesting because I've heard before, I haven't necessarily listened, but I've heard before that speed work is, if there was one thing you could do to make yourself better at ultras, it's speed work and maybe some weight training. But can you help dumb it down for us, for all of us who, don't have degrees in this? Why does speed work help? Why was my coach, 15 years ago getting me to do 100 meter and 200 meter sprints when I was training for a 100 miler? I never understood. I did it and then I stopped, but help us understand what's the science behind it. And maybe that will help some of the listeners actually do it, because it's painful.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of buckets with which this touches. The first is neuromuscular. So just how the brain processes some of these activities can adapt almost instantaneously. Like we'll see athletes that do their first session of 8 by 30-second hills or hill repeats of like 5 by 3 minutes, and their performance improves within 2 days. And that's a neuromuscular thing. That's something that happens in the nervous system. Next is biomechanical, which incorporates how the muscles put out power. So how every single threshold we're thinking about, whether it's aerobic threshold, lactate threshold, things like that, they're relying on how much actual force the muscles can generate. And that has to come from a certain percentage of your ceiling. And so, yeah, you can compress that some, but you can't compress it all the way. You need to keep raising the ceiling. And then finally, there's like smaller aerobic cardiovascular things like improving the cardiac stroke output and how the heart actually pumps. But the main things for us are, I think sometimes runners think of themselves like lungs on sticks. They don't actually think of their entire body and how it's connected through the brain into the muscles themselves. And that's why we really encourage this power framework, because every single athlete, when they hit these thresholds, like aerobic threshold, where you'll be racing a lot of your ultras time, that will be a certain percentage of their max output. And so if we're looking at that percentage, which can only be changed a little bit based on muscle fiber typology and things like that, we absolutely have to raise the top end, or an athlete is just going to be then looking in ultras for the little things like, I'm going to become better at aid stations or better with poles or anything like that. I'm like, instead of all of that, how about we raise your ceiling 20%? And then all of that stuff is barely going to matter.
And then I think a big thing over time that we've actually extended our philosophy on quite a bit is we've always been into strength training, and we call it kind of like minimal dose strength training. Like, I feel like you don't need to strength train for the purpose of hypertrophy or for the purpose of getting good at strength training. We want to strength train for the purpose of getting good at running. I feel like that also helps raise the ceiling too. And so we've been big fans of smart strength training, controlled strength training in conjunction with speed work, and using that to help build the power development as well as the injury resistance development for an athlete, which then allows athletes to like unlock their potential even at longer distances.
And that's particularly important for, as we talked about before, perimenopausal, menopausal athletes, aging male athletes. That's when strength starts to become indispensable. For young athletes, you get a mixed bag. Like there's one good study on the U.S. Olympic marathon trials, which found over half of the athletes didn't do a single dose of strength training. So it's not essential, but every single one of those athletes at the Olympic trials was doing fast strides and was doing speed work. And so the strength is important, but more of a supportive thing. And then as you age, it becomes like absolutely essential.
Absolutely. I think that brings us to one of the most interesting topics from a personal perspective anyway, and that's the women specific training issues. I want to talk about these differences between men and women. And I know that's an area of expertise for you, Megan, and how much that plays into the advice that you give to your athletes. Because my personal pet peeve is that women are so often thought of as just smaller or weaker men rather than different human beings who have different strengths and weaknesses. So maybe before we get into things like menstrual cycles and stuff, Megan, can you talk us through why you chose to focus on, female specific health and performance issues as your area of research?
Well, it's kind of wild because I stumbled into it before it really became a thing. And now it's like, it's so popular, which is amazing. Like, I feel like we have companies devoted to it. Hopefully, companies, research, institutions, like people are really focusing on it. And I think it's because there is this much broader awareness of like female athletes just haven't been included in exercise physiology studies. There's been like a lack of focus or even funding. Like you look at NCAA women's basketball and like for the longest time, it wasn't funded appropriately and it probably still isn't, but it's like the coolest sport. Like the ratings on NCAA March Madness women's basketball were just so cool. And so I think for me, when I was in med school, I was like, wow, like this area is so under researched and so fascinating too, because it's like, I feel like because it's under researched, we're still figuring out how to best train female athletes, how to help female athletes through complex challenges like REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, or low energy availability, and things like pregnancy. And so there's so many unique physiological considerations, plus the fact that it was untapped. And I was like, wow, like this is a really interesting area to study. And I kind of got lucky in that I feel like I'm almost riding this wave of like, there's been a lot of funding and opportunity. And I'm so excited to see how that translates downstream to female athletes and to performance and even to participation too, because it's not just about like, you know, helping athletes be the very best they can be, which is a big part of it. It's also about like, how can we get athletes to stay in sport and like find trail running? It's really cool physiology and it's beautiful physiology too, like the menstrual cycle and pregnancy and, you know, some of the unique like complications of, you know, how do we help athletes fuel their bodies so that they can be the strongest versions of themselves? And
how does testosterone change the game?
Yeah, exactly.
When you have male hormones, you know, it's just training is a little bit different. It just is, because testosterone is, as you know, like we've joked before, it's like testosterone is a hell of a drug in the sense that when you have it naturally, like a man does, like, you know, the training context changes, the recovery context changes. And it's important to consider that in training, because if you don't, you're essentially like banging someone's head into a wall or throwing eggs at a wall. And occasionally one of those eggs might not break, but that doesn't mean that it was smart to throw the egg against the wall in the first place.
I always have to remind myself of that when I run with you. And I'm like, testosterone is a heck of a drug, as you're like talking to me very naturally and I'm breathing very heavy. I'm like, there are some fundamental physiological differences here. So yeah, it is helpful, but no, it's been really fun. And I think more and more we're seeing that like the research on female athletes get applied into training theory. And it's interesting for me as a coach, like I don't necessarily like fundamentally change my training when I look at like the differences between male and female athletes, but I feel like there are differences surrounding the nuances. Like, you know, maybe a female athlete comes to me and, you know, she's having painful periods and we adjust based around that. And so I feel like for me as a coach, it's the nuances and how training gets changed is much more on an individual than a population-based level. And I think it's also on a level of just like talking really openly to female athletes about these things, because oftentimes in like a world of male sport, like male coaches, they haven't, like no one has asked them about their period or asked them about like, you know, family planning or things like this. And it's been just really rewarding to get to do that as a coach.
So something we've talked about on the Trail Talks podcast before is how menstrual cycles affect training. And actually because those of us who were on the podcast, we didn't have science degrees, we didn't know the answer. Is there, I know some people feel more energy at some parts of their cycle. Are there commonalities across female athletes where we might want to train more during a certain part of our cycle, or we might want to focus on something else, or is it all different?
This is a great question. And it's a question that's been talked about a lot recently, just because I feel like there's been a lot more conversation about the menstrual cycle, which is amazing. And by and large, actually, when you look at and consolidate like the population-based data, it comes together to say there's no difference when you look at population-based levels. And so for me as an athlete, like I don't necessarily gather athletes' menstrual cycle and make menstrual cycles at the outset and change training recommendations based off of that. Like it's always done on an individual level. And when you look at the studies, there are individual data points where maybe someone during the late luteal phase, which is like the last part of the menstrual cycle, classically like PMS timeframe, maybe they're feeling rough and not training as well classically during this time. And so we might back off on training. And so for me as a coach, it's much more about the individual level training differences than adjusting things on a population-based level for menstrual cycle. And it also fits the reality too that there's just so many different lived versions of what a menstrual cycle is for an athlete. Like some athletes are on hormonal contraceptives, other athletes are experiencing a cycle naturally, and maybe some athletes have amenorrhea and we're working towards a cycle. And so in reality, it's almost like with the athletes I coach, I have like 20 different data points and we're handling the menstrual cycle differently in each of those.
Yeah. And one of the things I always love is, some of the hormonal research indicates that maybe at the start of your period, you're in a really good place for performance. Some athletes, absolutely not. Like in no way.
Some athletes feel terrible during that time.
Terrible.
Yes. Yeah.
And the point just being like, it's not, hormones do not dictate performance. Like it's so much more complicated that it's one small variable in a very large set of them.
And the problem is that if we adapt for that variable, it's almost like we're missing the 4,000 other variables that because we're so focused on this one, which is why I always do it on an individual base level.
Yeah, because some people absolutely need to make changes, and that's awesome.
Like for me in PMS, like right before I get my period, I feel like I'm breathing heavy. I feel sloggy. My legs feel heavy. But the reality is like I'm racing Canyon's 100K in 2 weeks, and I'll be right at that part in the cycle, and I'll be drawing on the long runs, the workouts, the efforts that I did, because the reality is I'm going to have to race then anyways. And so I think it's about like, changing training when it's smart, but then also recognizing too that like we're going to have to race at all these different time points. And so it's nice to have the confidence to draw from training as well.
Yeah. I think because there's all of this unknown areas of research with women, I just feel, maybe this is a hope, but I just feel like the potential for the women's field to get better and better and better is so much bigger than the men's field because it has been more researched, because there's more things that we can change. There's more things that we can still experiment with that we haven't discovered yet. Is that off?
No, it's so true. And my hope is that research also drives participation as well. And so we've known for a long time that like young girls are dropping out of sport. And it's like, okay, well, like maybe if we make better sports bras or like have better conversations about training around the menstrual cycle at young ages, we'll also have a larger denominator of women competing, and thus it'll be more competitive. There'll be more opportunities. And so I think the research trickles down into so many unique areas that like we're still even considering. And I think it's going to be amazing how that drives sport, how that drives like the fun of sport and even like media coverage of sport. So I'm really excited to see how that trickles down.
And I think one really cool thing is how the women's research now, it's not like, I think sometimes it's been viewed as, oh, it's this separate thing. But now I think it's also helping inform performance across the board, including for male athletes, in a way that's really cool and the opposite of what's happened historically, in the sense that, because of amenorrhea and loss of the menstrual cycle, we have a much bigger focus on relative energy deficiency in sport, which largely stemmed from female athletes to begin with. But now, as we do more studies and gather more information, we're seeing that the same problems are affecting male athletes who don't have their periods and who are struggling because of it. I love
that male athletes who don't have their periods.
Yeah,
who wouldn't have a period if they had periods. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
I would love it if male athletes had periods. It would make the world a lot more interesting.
Yeah, but the point just being like, human physiology works in different ways for men and women, but the connections are so fascinating. And whatever we learn from men might be able to be applied for women, and same vice versa. And I think, not just having men be the default is key, because we'll also start learning in both directions if we start on women being the default for some studies too.
Now, I want to take a bit of a shift in our kind of last main topic before I go into some rapid fire questions. Is one of the aspects that, we really want to bring out on the Trail Talks podcast is more discussions around inclusivity. And I recognize that all of us on this, in this discussion are white, cisgendered, heteronormative people at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about the kinds of issues that are continuing to come up in the ultra running community and the trail running community. And I think you guys have been advocates for inclusivity, and I want to touch on one topic. David, you coach Riley Brady. Mm-hmm. He's a non-binary athlete, and in November 2022, you wrote an article with Riley about non-binary athlete inclusion and acceptance in running. Now, I know there was some blowback in the community around this topic. I know there's some controversy around this topic. I think it continues to be a topic that we haven't quite nailed in terms of inclusivity in races in our sport, including with trans athletes as well. Can you just talk us through, I think it was the Javelina race that kind of was the instigator for why this article came out. Can you talk about, what happened at the race and some of the controversy that led to the article? Yeah,
so what happened is Javelina was a golden ticket race to Western states, so place mattered at the top end. And that the way that the result systems were structured, Riley, as a non-binary athlete competing in the female division, was classified separately on the results page, which led to allegedly some confusion amongst one competitor in particular, which I think brought up a lot of other issues that people have, like culturally sometimes, on these topics. And essentially it all got resolved. Riley got the golden ticket, and is one of the best people and athletes out there. But the reason we wrote that article is that essentially just wanted to say, like, I think a lot of the times pushes against inclusivity and that sort of thing almost always stem from a lack of like personal understanding, like personal experience with it. So it's not a question of bigotry or anything like that. And I want to say, like, anyone, even if you disagree, infinite love. Like, the whole point of this is, like, it all starts from that loving place. And so our goal with the article is essentially to say, here is the facts, and running in athletics is this place where we all are seeking some sort of, like cushion against the realities of life. And it gives us purpose and meaning, all the things we talked about before. And that should be available to everyone. And the exact way it's available can vary a lot. And, the exact policies take some dialing in. Like non-binary athletes, I think that's a pretty uncomplicated one. Give people the opportunity to, compete within the context of their gender identity, but then also, compete for prizes, that is their, biological sex in the case of non-binary athletes. Trans athletes, obviously a little more complicated and beyond the scope of this conversation, but a place we also argue for inclusivity, with certain guidelines. But the point being that this sport is about love and acceptance and openness and purpose and all of those things. And everyone should have that opportunity, and start from that place. Get to know the individual stories and make sure we're not legislating problems that don't exist. And essentially, the more open we can be to everyone, the more love the sport can have, and the better the sport will be, not just for the non-binary athletes, but for everyone that competes.
And I think for me, like, my heart and brain have always been aligned on the basis of inclusivity. But for me, it also really took coaching athletes and getting to know their stories and getting to know them personally. And I actually just saw Riley this morning. I was at biking, and Riley was crushing a workout, and I gave them the biggest high five. And I was like, oh shit. Like, I was going like 20 miles an hour when I gave them a high five. I was like, I hope I didn't just rip off their shoulder.
They said it was the fastest high five they've ever had.
I hope they're okay. Yes.
Yeah, they're okay.
But Riley is one of my all-time favorite humans, and I would do anything for Riley. And I think I feel the same way about some of the transgender athletes I've coached. Riley's non-binary, and I just want I want Riley to have experiences where they are fully lived in their gender, in their sport. And I think that, like, if you feel differently about these issues, I just encourage people to get to know non-binary transgender people, because, like, I mean, I'm like, I can't even, like, I'm almost speechless, because they're some of my favorite athletes I've ever worked with. And I just want them to be able to compete and to be able to have a fully lived trail and ultra experience. And it matters. It matters to have their gender and their pronouns and everything recognized. And if that's their fully lived experience in sport, especially for non-binary athletes, we need to give that to them. Yeah. And I just love Riley so much. And I hope they're okay from that high five I just gave them.
Yeah, running is the place for acceptance. Like, that's the core of where we start. And there are other places in life where these issues get more complicated. And we're not talking about that. We're not saying that people's entire worldviews are wrong. It's way more complicated. Everyone's bringing different things into the equation. But in this little subset of life, which is running and athletics, we can take an open, inclusive approach. And then maybe if things become a big issue for like transgender athletes down the line, then consider like some sort of narrowing of the process. But before then, let people live and let people love and let them experience purpose, because that's what makes the sport magical for every single one of us.
Well, thanks for being open to talking about that. I've now just got a few rapid fire questions that I'm going to throw at you. I want you both to answer, so you can decide who goes first. And then we'll wrap things up. So you ready to go?
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Okay. Number 1, favorite distance to run?
50K.
I'm going to say a 12-miler on a Tuesday.
Yeah. Ooh, wow. Spicy.
Yeah.
Okay. Favorite distance to coach?
Ooh. I'll jump in first. I'd say 50 miles, because it takes in some of that really cool, interesting, uncertain ultra science, and then mixes it with fastest person might win. So I like it.
I was going to say 100K purely because I feel like the number of 50-mile races that we have dropped.
It's true.
Like, I feel like there's so many more 100Ks. And so, I'm going to go with that for the same purposes.
But then, slight wrinkle to that, I also love like track 5K or something like that. The
steeplechase.
I love ultra training theory because there's a lot of different ways to do it. But when we start talking about track training theory, oh my gosh, it gets so interesting. And
so spicy.
You're talking about, 75 years of history, and you have to know to be as good as you can, you have to know what everyone is doing in the world and understand the nuances of it. I just freaking love it.
I will take your word for it. Okay, next question. If you could coach any athlete in the world, who would it be?
This is tricky. I'm going to go Adam Peterman, the Peter God himself, who doesn't need a coach, or from me at least. He might be coached by somebody else, but one of the kindest people I've ever met. Also one of the best athletes, maybe the best athlete in the world. We'll see what happens at Western States this year. But I would say the Peter God.
Yeah, honestly, I would say Courtney DeWalter. She's just because she doesn't need any training help. And honestly, she should just do what she's doing. Like, she does not need a coach at this point. But I just want to talk to her about ice cream in her training log every day. Yeah. So yeah, I want to be her coach friend.
Good answer. Okay. Best trail running performance of any athlete over the last 12 months.
I mean, everything Courtney has done.
Yeah.
But to be a little controversial, I'm going to say Jim at UTMB, just because the way he set himself up for years and years and years to have that performance, I think showed just the margins being so slim for it. I think at this point, you almost have to have Courtney in a separate category because everything she does is unthinkable.
Well, if you pick Jim, you gave me the kindness of choosing Courtney as her Triple Crown, which honestly, I think I agree about Jim's performance, but I think stacking the Triple Crown of races that she did is the physiological recovery that she had to make that possible, I think is untouchable in future history.
I want to throw in one more though. Short distance, mountain championships last year, Grayson Murphy winning the world championship. Absolutely dominant performance. Grayson is now a many-time world champion. She's still very young. We have the greatest of all time in the short distances. At the same time, we have the greatest of all time in long distances. And I think sometimes people might be missing out that we have a legend in our midst.
I knew we would talk way over time because there's so much to talk about on this. We didn't even talk about your last race, which you mentioned briefly, but I have to say before we end that Megan, you came in with the second fastest time ever. And also in first place.
Yes. Yeah. It was fun.
Yeah.
David came in second under the course record. I mean, you guys are the definition of a power couple. You're so fun to talk to. And I really think all of the listeners are going to take so much away. Now, where can people find you if they want to follow up?
We have a podcast, lots of jokes.
Some work, all play.
Some work, all play podcast.
Go give it a click.
Yeah. David has a Mountain Roach Instagram. I'm Meg Runs Happy. You can check out pictures of his face on the Instagram.
But the main thing to do is go to wherever you found this podcast, the ITRA podcast, and go click follow on it and give it 5 stars.
Oh, yes. We're going to go do that. Yep.
Give this, that is a huge way to support.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah.
To support this type of work. It's wild. Doing a podcast, how much of a difference that ends up making for everything, like how people find it, ends up sponsorship, things like that. So go give this podcast 5 stars. It'll take 5 seconds of your time. ITRA, 5 stars now.
David is our advertiser. You crushed it.
Yes.
Thanks, guys.
This was so fun.